Thank you very much. You know, when you write books at my age, you often get questions as to why do you write them. And I say to them, the honest reason is I'm a terminal masochist. I love getting roasted by my very best friends. And probably the best roaster I know is Ted Sorensen. My previous book called Gray Dawn, Ted Sorensen said, let me tell you about Peterson's book, Gray Dawn. He said, Gray Dawn is a book that once you put it down, you won't be able to pick it up. So I couldn't wait for his verbal attack on this one, and it wasn't long in coming. He said, Pete, when I saw the title Running on Empty, I had assumed it was an autobiography. But there's a second reason that may sound sanctimonious and self-serving, but it does have the virtue of being true. I have 5 kids and 9 grandkids, and I've got a fortunate lifestyle. I can spend some time with them. And the comment by a German theologian named Bonhoeffer rang in my ears. Bonhoeffer said once that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And as we quietly pass on huge and I think unthinkable taxes and debts on our kids, and as we quietly slip to our own children and grandchildren the check for our free lunch, I think we are failing that moral test. So I suggest in this book that maybe our politicians should rephrase the question that Ronald Reagan asked in 1980, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? To a different kind of question, is the future going to be better off, and are our kids going to be better off than we are today? Now, when I say this, some people say, well, are you suggesting that parents don't care about their children? And I say, absolutely not. But I am saying that parents and grandparents are grossly uninformed, misinformed, and disinformed by a combination that's very unhealthy of political and bureaucratic amnesia and anesthesia. A little anecdote. The only developed country leader that I know that has confronted the profound fiscal implications of aging societies was Prime Minister Lady Thatcher. And I said to Lady Thatcher one day, Lady Thatcher, when you have your G7 and G8 meetings, are the other developed countries' leaders aware of what we're doing to our kids in the future? And she said, oh my, yes, Mr. Peterson, they're all aware of it. Well, I said, why don't they do something about it? And she said, well, the theory is it's not going to hit on my watch. And why should I take the pain for somebody else's gain? So permit me to give you a few examples of the political hijinks, hypocrisy, and chutzpah. Let me start with the unfunded, off-the-books liabilities, or if you prefer, the hidden liabilities and obligations. Official sources, not Pete Peterson, puts the unfunded liabilities at somewhere between $45 trillion and $74 trillion in today's dollars, depending on the time frame. Now that's more than the collective net worth of the entire country, which is about $42 trillion. Now some hypocrisy and chutzpah. The Congress passes a Sarbanes-Oxley bill that makes it a crime for public corporations not to accurately report their liabilities. They pass an ERISA law that says that corporations must fund their pensions in no more than 30 years. Now, were the Sarbanes-Oxley and ERISA requirements obtained to the federal pensions and retirement plans, it would add over $1.5 trillion to the annual budget that the public knows nothing about. Now, I suggest in this book a number of reforms, but the most fanciful, undoubtedly, is the one where I suggest that if it's good enough for public corporations, why doesn't the government operate its retirement programs under the same disclosure requirements. Now, why is it fanciful? Well, we can safely assume that Congress's enthusiasm for this idea would be very restrained. Let me give you a second example of the hijinks. We see constant references to the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. When I was Secretary of Commerce, I picked up Time magazine once, and they referred to me as the most powerful Secretary of Commerce since Herbert Hoover. I burst out laughing for two reasons. In the first place, I had no idea what they were referring to, given Herbert Hoover's legacy. And secondly, I burst out laughing because anybody that's had that job knows there's never been a powerful Secretary of Commerce. So I started a career of collecting oxymorons. One of my favorites is the House Ethics Committee. But another one is a powerful Secretary of Commerce. These trust funds should not be trusted, and they're not funded. And while we anesthetize the public with all kinds of soothing statements that Social Security is solvent until the year 2042, we do not tell people that there's nothing in the trust fund but liabilities. And were we to fund Social Security and Medicare, our kids' payroll taxes would have to be doubled. And whether we have a trust fund or not is pragmatically irrelevant, because you still have the same three alternatives. You increase taxes, you suddenly cut benefits, or you try to borrow the money. Now, how much would we have to borrow? I think it's time we told the American people that these are pay-as-you-go programs and to think in cash flow terms. The projected cash flow deficits for the two systems, the base case, which is usually optimistic, go from a $25 billion deficit this last year to $783 in 2020, 15 years from now, and into the trillions thereafter. We tell the American people that the system is solvent until the year 2042. The truth is, in the year 2018, it starts going cash flow negative. And between 2018 and 2042, the deficits aggregate to $5.1 trillion in present dollars. Then, of course, there are the benign euphemisms or dysphemisms. One of my favorites is, we shall not pass on our problems to the next generation. Someone might be discourteous enough to say, who the hell are we passing them on to? Or, it is your money, and you deserve it back. Well, who does the debt belong to then? The ages or what? Now, I was presumably educated at the University of Chicago, and Milton Friedman used to try to teach us that a long-term tax cut was not a tax cut at all unless it was accompanied by long-term spending. It was just a deferred tax increase on our children. Now, another beauty that we use with the American public is the idea of a social contract. Now, when the American people hear the word contract, it sounds like an immutable legal liability. But when I went to business school, I was taught that the minimum requirement for a contract is a meeting of the minds of the parties. So at a book party, I thought I'd dramatize this point a bit by bringing my 7-year-old granddaughter up to the stage, Chloe Kimball. And my conversation with my granddaughter went as follows. Darling, have you signed on to $74 trillion of unfunded liabilities? She says, Papa, as she calls me, is a trillion more than a billion? I said, yes, darling, it's 1,000 times more. And she says, wow, I'm going to have to sell a lot more lemonade. I then say, and have you signed on to a doubling of your payroll taxes? And she says, Papa, you're going to have to increase my allowance. Indeed. Now, due to the fact that I'm what you might call an equal opportunity basher, and my relentless need to offend everyone, I will attack now the theologies of both parties. I use the theologies of our political parties deliberately because many of their policies seem faith-directed, they're relatively untouched by analysis or evidence, and they're delivered with a kind of moral certitude. My party, and I've been a Republican all my life, has a number of theologies. The most recent is the tax cut theology, in which it has morphed into any tax cut any time and will grow out of whatever the implications are. To continue the theological metaphor, the tax cutters in my party have been joined over the last several years by an unholy alliance with the big spending, big government Republicans. Now, Down Kendall and I will remember the days when a big government conservative would have been an oxymoron too. Ironically, it was my party that did away with spending caps. We did away with pay-as-you-go rules, which in the 90s had contributed a lot to the era of fiscal responsibility. Now, this isn't just Pete Peterson, the aging curmudgeon, saying this. The Cato Institute, a very conservative institution, as you know, refers to the last several years as the spending explosion. John McCain cites the spending in the last binge in the last 4 years, the worst in 22 years. And I quote him. He said, "It's like any other evil. First you condemn it, then you condone it, and finally you embrace it." Now, finally, these Republicans are joined by another group that are called the Starve the Beasters. Now, it's paradoxically that the Starve the Beasters disagree with the supply-siders. They say if you cut taxes, of course revenues will go down, and that's what we want. Because that way, we can get rid of these government awful benefit programs. I've debated the Starve the Beasters, and I say to them, you people better be careful what you wish for. Have you considered certain melancholy facts? 1/3 of the 65-year-olds in this country have no net financial savings at all. And according to the Social Security Administration, if you look at all the current retirees, 20%, the bottom, which when you have 77 million boomers beginning to retire, is millions of people, depend on these benefits for 91% of their cash income. And I say to them, I want you to picture the current scene for me. 77 million boomers, twice the current number of elderly, some tens of millions of whom depend on these programs. And you're going to go to them one sunny day and say to them, sorry, folks, we're going to have to immediately cut your benefits substantially. And there are going to be no social or political effects. And they're going to say to you, thank you. I needed that. I deserve that for my fiscal profligacy. And I say to them, by the way, Starve the Beasters, if you're so interested in a smaller government, why haven't you put forth a program for reducing the costs of these entitlement programs? And by the way, Beasters, when in a crisis did a government ever get smaller? If I may be permitted one more, by the way, which I do hope is not unfair, one might say to the President, sir, in the face of this spending explosion, how is it that you're the first full-term president since John Quincy Adams not to veto a single bill? So to sum up my party, we've done LBJ one better. We have guns, we have butter, and we have tax cuts. Now let me turn to my Democratic former friends. If my party has not seen a tax cut it did not like, many Democrats have not seen an entitlement program, a universal entitlement program, that they did not want to create or expand. Now, during the time when I think the Democrats were the prime mover with a bit of help from a few in my party, you may not be aware of the following rather startling fact. In the last 40 years, federal benefits to individuals have gone up 6 times after inflation. Now, when I quiz my Democratic friends about where is your plan for reforming Social Security. And I asked Senator Bob Kerrey that, a Democrat. Bob says, Pete, I'm surprised that you don't know about the Democratic plan. And I said, well, I'm not aware of one. Why don't you tell me what it is? He said, yeah, we call it the Do Nothing plan. I said, I see. Thank you, sir. Now, viewed currently in the Medicare prescription drug benefit, I know of no serious analyst who does not believe that the current Medicare programs are simply unsustainable in terms of the costs. Yet, without hardly a single word about what we're going to do about the costs, the principal objection of most Democrats is that the program doesn't go nearly far enough. So I argue in this book that both parties have conspired to build a kind of pragmatic theology, which is a vision of America as all gain and no pain, and all get and no give, and win elections at any cost, including and especially to our own children. And you wonder whether in this world that we've created, one might ask the question, is it ever politically correct for someone to ask our citizens to give up something for the general good? Now, one might ask, Peterson, you have been boring us relentlessly for 20 years on these programs. What's new? Well, I think beyond the obvious fact that the 77 million boomers start retiring in 5 years, this is not that far off problem we used to be able to deny. I suggest there are three important new realities. All three are around a basic theme, which is a profound disconnect between ends and means. All three are about an unwillingness to confront the long-term trade-offs between national security, retirement security, global and domestic economic security, and a vast number of human capital needs. The first new factor is an unprecedented national security agenda to fight two wars: wars abroad, as in Iraq, and the war on terror at home. Now, while we say we will pay any price, and we all know that these wars will be going on for some time, the evidence to me is overwhelming that we have seriously underestimated the cost, and we are fighting these two wars without a war budget. Now, some of us have probably forgotten that while our superpower military is stunningly effective, it is also stunningly expensive. I'm old enough to remember the good old days in World War II, when wars were kind of like a federal jobs program. You hired low-cost labor with low-cost equipment. But in today's very high-tech, very high-cost military, the brute fact is, to give you one example, the costs of a so-called stability operation in Iraq with only 2 divisions is something like $1 billion every week. Let me give you some other factoids. The Congressional Budget Office, which is after all under Republican administration, have looked at our defense budget, and they point out 2 of many, many disturbing facts. As it's currently constituted, they estimate that it's at least 18% understated, or $1 trillion. They point out about many other things. There's no provision for additional troops, even though 54 out of 61 members of the House Armed Services Committee have complained bitterly that we have a 10-division Army for a 12-division set of objectives. The second war, of course, is the war on terror at home. And I'm proud of the leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations in analyzing this problem and laying it out. Now, in spite of all of the rhetoric, the evidence to me is overwhelming that we have many critical holes in Homeland Security, protecting only 4% of the cargo containers, first responders without adequate equipment, as we discovered at 9/11, a healthcare system that is not ready to handle a biomedical attack, the lack of effective immigration control, protecting critical infrastructure and refineries or energy resources, and on and on. Now, the second new reality, to me, that's receiving far too little attention in this country are not simply the budget deficit, but it's the younger twin deficit, which we might think of as the foreign or current account deficit. The previous record in the United States was in the 80s, when the current account deficit was 3.7% of the GDP. The dollar fell by a third, and there was a lot of other associated damage in stock markets and so forth. Today, you may not be aware of the fact that the current account deficit is at a stunning 5.7% of the GDP, and by most accounts heading into utterly unthinkable territory. But even at current levels, where we're borrowing at the rate of $670 billion a year, every day, workday, we have to import $2.5 billion of foreign capital. Now, even the IMF, that usually focuses on the third world, as you know, is giving us hell. They point out that a 5% of the GDP deficit is a danger point. They point out that a 40% external debt to foreigners as a percent of the GDP is, quote unquote, unprecedented level for a large industrial country. So as part of this book, I interviewed a dozen experts who know a lot more than I do about global capital markets. None of these 12 believe that current account deficits at anything like this level are sustainable. In the White House in which I served, we had Herb Stein, who was a Nixon humorist, which will strike nearly all of you as an oxymoron, I suppose. And he once said, if something is unsustainable, it tends to stop. Or he said, if you don't like that one, if your horse dies, I suggest you dismount. So the question is, are we going to get off gently or are we going to be thrown off? Now, roughly half of the experts I talked to believe there is a substantial risk of a hard or a crash landing. Paul Volcker, for example, believes that there's a 75% chance of such a crisis in the next 5 years. We have our Citigroup friend here, Bob Rubin, as you know, refers with his usually constructive, ambiguous language to we confront a day of serious reckoning. Now, what is a hard landing? It envisions a sudden drop in the dollar for reasons that are very hard to predict, a steep hike in interest rates with very nasty effects on financial markets and, of course, the economy. Now, the other half, while saying that these are unsustainable, think the odds are pretty good there'll be a softer or soft landing. But in those landings, the same phenomenon take place of a dropping dollar and increased interest rates. They just take place more gradually. But they would be the first to tell you, make no mistake about it, this is a landing we're talking about and not a takeoff. Now, I've decided that the blunt truth is no one knows when and how these deficits are going to be made sustainable. But everyone agrees they must be made sustainable. You know, we have talked so much in this country about the outsourcing of jobs. I wish we'd spend some more time talking about the risks of the outsourcing for foreign savings. Now, we have a profound global imbalance in the world economy, and it's going to require some very fundamental, and I hope not traumatic, changes in our country's political economies. Our country, which has become obsessed with consumption, must consume and import less. It must save relatively more. And the rest of the world, developed world, is going to have to do the opposite. And given the difficulties of these adjustments, because we have a kind of dysfunctional dependence, a friend of mine said he finally understood supply-side economics. The foreigners supply the goods and they also supply the money. Well, the foreigners in turn have this dysfunctional dependence on their exports to this country. And given the difficulties of these adjustments, I agree with Alan Greenspan. One of the things that we should all be concerned about is countries to a, quote, solution of protectionism, which would have a really nasty effect on confidence in this country. Now, whatever the odds and whatever the outcome, I argue in this book that these are risks that a great country should not be taking. This is a foreign policy organization, and they're not simply economic and domestic risks. I would argue there are national security risks. There are foreign policy risks of how long this country can bet on the proposition that it's the biggest borrower and the biggest debtor in the world, can also be a great power and a superpower. The third new reality is the rapidly aging world and the gargantuan fiscal demands that it imposes. We Americans are pretty provincial. We say our $77 million boomer problem is large. However, the problem in other developed countries is far more severe and will hit far sooner and harder. Why? Birth rates abroad, as many of you know, are far lower than they are here. And these countries confront, unlike us, a big drop in young tax-paying workers. Italy and Spain, your chairman is from Spain originally, as you know, has a birth rate of 1.2, the lowest in the developed world. Remember, it takes 2.1 babies per woman to keep population stable. Japan has a birth rate of 1.3, but for a lot of reasons, they expect a sudden drop in the next 10 years of 25% in the number of workers under the age of 30. Besides that, in most developed countries, their benefits are much higher. They retire much earlier. In France, only 34% of the people between 55 and 64 are working. Only 7% in the continental Europe have any pension. The unions are much more powerful. Their taxes are already much higher, 35% of payroll tax in some countries. Our mutual friends at the Center for Strategic and International Studies has done an elaborate study of the future cost of aging benefits in the developed countries outside of the United States. Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and so forth. They'll grow from 15% of the GDP now to 28% over the next 40 years. Now that strikes me as an unthinkable and unsustainable bill. Speaking of Japan, let me tell you a little anecdote. I'm sitting at the council next to Mr. Kuroda, as my friend here from Citigroup will know, former Vice Minister of Finance. Mr. Kuroda, is aging society a major challenge to your country? Very big problem. Mr. Kuroda, how are you going to finance the huge and growing bills of your aging society? Well, Mr. Peterson, unlike your country, we have a big savings rate, and we have a big capital account surplus, so for a while, we can sustain it that way. But Mr. Kuroda, you are financing 25% of our current account deficit. Have you figured out how to spend the same money twice? He says, very difficult challenge. Now, remembering that one speech from me is one too many, permit me to only say that I've suggested to Richard Hawes, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, that people in foreign policy might well benefit from some major studies and task forces on the daunting implication on foreign policy and on the national security, international development budgets of countries as they try to make the tortuous decision balanced against the politically powerful and exploding costs of these highly organized senior benefits. Finally, I lay out some reforms in this book, and I'm going to focus on the economic and fiscal, not the political. They're built around a simple theme, and that is that this country must substantially increase its rate of national savings. It's irresponsible for us to be this dependent on foreign savings. There are two ways to do this. First, we can reduce the dissavings or negative effects of budgets, huge budget deficits. And without reform of the entitlements, this is a fool's mission. Secondly, we're going to have to figure out a way of increasing personal savings. Now, as to reforming entitlements, I'm talking about both Social Security and Medicare. And among the things that many do not realize is that Medicare is not only the biggest fiscal problem, accounting for over 80% of the unfunded liabilities, but it is filled with ethical, moral, and other issues. Now, some of my Democratic friends say, well, we can solve this problem by eliminating the Bush tax cuts. Now, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that even if we repeal all of the Bush tax cuts, and no one's proposing that, just the ones on most of us in this room, they are only about 10% of the problem. So we're going to have to confront the rather brute fact that any reform of entitlement will necessarily involve reductions in benefits. Let's start with Social Security. For years, I used to make a series of proposals. Let's gradually increase the retirement age. Let's have an affluence test for those of us in this room above the median income, on the grounds that the means test sounds kind of mean, you know. And I've decided that this multi-step approach tends to aggregate a sense of negatives. So I was searching for a simpler macro approach that might be also easier to explain to parents and children. It's quite widely known that Social Security is indexed 100%. Don Kendall, you'd be interested, your dear friend Richard Nixon. You may recall this was passed in the 70s. And Richard Nixon told me that the biggest mistake he made was to permit 100% indexing, which does not take place in the private sector, as you know, generally. But what is not known is that Social Security benefits are also indexed to wages. So when people say we can grow out of this problem, they're misinforming you, because as wages go up with increased productivity and growth, so do the costs go up. So if we were to eliminate the indexing to wages and just have an index to inflation, which is what Margaret Thatcher did, we would eliminate the unfunded liabilities of Social Security. I make a second proposal that perhaps will stun some of you, given my Republican origins, that we're probably going to need a mandatory savings plan in which we set up accounts for workers of 2 to 3% with some subsidy for the poor that are managed by some kind of public-private board. Now, why should they be mandatory? Let me tell you of an experience I had in the 90s. I was asked by the White House and the Congress to chair a commission or a committee on capital formation and savings in America. Because I was not expert in it, I recruited the best savings economists left, right, and center that I could. And I said to them, tell me what our experience is in America with the various tax incentives, because you undoubtedly know that savings in this country have grown from about 8% of the GDP to 0.2 at the moment, and consumer debt has risen to 85% of the GDP. We have indeed become a consumption-obsessed society. So I said, what's the effect of all these tax incentives? And they said, well, Pete, the effects are limited and quite ambiguous. And one of the reasons is that people who take advantage of these would have saved anyway, and it adds substantially to the cost. Well, I said, what are you saying? On the one hand, you say to me, we must increase savings, and then on the other hand, you say most of these tax incentives are not, at the margin, particularly significant. They said, what we're saying to you, and as America, given our consumption obsession, if you want to increase savings, you're going to have to make it mandatory. And this, of course, is what Chile has done very successfully, what Singapore did under Lee Kuan Yew, what Australia is now doing. Now, my proposal is that this money should be invested in global index funds, both fixed income and equity. Why index funds? Some of the people who are pushing hard on individual retirement accounts are not telling us that the accounts are extremely small and the administrative costs would substantially reduce the net returns. Furthermore, if you put your money in index fund, you avoid the political battles of which are and are not politically correct industries. Now, why a public-private board? This government, like most developed countries' governments, have fundamentally made the point that you cannot trust democracies as they're currently constituted to keep their hands off of any surplus. You remember the lockbox, of course. You remember the trust fund. And what we've been doing for the last 60 years is spending the huge surpluses on other purposes. These savings must be taken out of the hands of the government, and they must be invested in the private sector where they can truly get better returns and help our economy. What about Medicare? We don't have time to get into it. It's a much bigger problem and more formidable, not only fiscally, but because of the moral, ethical, and political issues. Because what we're talking about here, ultimately, is who dies and who lives and who gets what treatment and how do we decide who gets what treatment. It confronts what Dan Yakelovich, public opinion poster, calls the maximum right mentality in America, in which we have been taught that Americans are, quote, entitled, not my favorite word, to all of the high-tech, high-cost treatments. And it's a mentality that has led our spending on health care to be about twice as much as a percent of the GDP of other countries, rising dramatically. And there is no reasonable evidence that our health outcomes are any better than theirs. So I present a number of proposals. Now finally, what are the possible scenarios? I give you two options for you to consider. One I vastly prefer. Scenario A says the American public needs a massive dose of truth-telling. And as I've reflected on the momentum and impact of the 9/11 Commission, I recommend that this president immediately appoint what I would call a bipartisan twin deficit commission of trusted Americans at the most senior levels, not special interest devotees whose only reform is I want more. I'm talking about people like Paul Volcker, Bob Rubin, Sam Nunn, Warren Rudman, Bob Kerry, Alan Simpson, and so forth. It will take bold leadership by a president who not only educates and leads Americans to constructive action, but in the ideal case creates a global consensus on this issue, because this is a global problem if I ever saw one. Now, why might a president do that? I can think of only two reasons. One, a desire to avoid this problem hitting on their watch, and what a legacy that would leave. And secondly, if this president could be the first one to really attack this problem, what a wonderful legacy that would be for them. This must be done in a bipartisan setting. I was brought up in Nebraska, and we had what we used to call, in hunting circles, the turkey shoot phenomenon. In a partisan setting, any partisan from one party that has the courage to make a truly honest suggestion gets his head shot off, as we observed in the recent election. So the only, quote, reform suggestions you get in an election is, I promise not to increase taxes, I promise to increase benefits, I promise not to cut benefits, and that ends up being counterproductive to real reform. Scenario B is much to be deplored. It's what you might call the crisis or Pearl Harbor scenario. And incidentally, in my book, I've interviewed a lot of people, and there are a lot of hard heads in this country who believe that we will only make progress in the midst of a crisis. I pray that's not the case, because it will leave all kinds of profound costs on our economy and our society. I want to thank you very much, and I also want to ask you to remember what Ted Sorensen would be happy to remind you of. Don't put my book down. You will not be able to pick it up. Thank you very much.